What is sex trafficking? Sex trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or attaining of a person of a commercial sex act where such an act is induced by force, fraud, or oppression. International demographics. Human trafficking is a fast-growing problem in our world. 10 to 30 million modern-day slaves exist. Human trafficking is the second largest criminal industry, generating over about $30 billion. Sexual exploitation is the most identified form of human trafficking. About 161 countries are affected by some form of human trafficking. Cultural factors. 80% of sex trafficking is not just prostitution, but it is the enslavement of people who are not willing to enter the market of being exploited sexually. For us to understand sex trafficking more, we have to understand the cultural dynamics of each person who is involved in the exchange. The three main people involved in the exchange are the victims, the Johns, and the traffickers. The victims. The victims are more than likely to be women and children. Many of the victims, about 78%, become victims in their adolescent years. Many of the victims have backgrounds of poverty and illiteracy. Also, many of the victims come from low social and political statuses. There are studies that show that about 80% of victims express some type of sexual, emotional, or physical abuse. Traffickers take the advantage of victims from these backgrounds. Research has also revealed that most of the victims will live on an average about 7 years after entering the sex. The pimps. Pimps are known as the traffickers, and they perpetrate a culture of withholding the victims. The pimps will hold the victims through different acts of threats, violence, or manipulation. A lot of victims fall into the trap of the pimp through dating, and then the male becomes their boyfriends. Later, their pimps. The pimps look for the vulnerable. Eventually, they will run off together for a better life, quote unquote. Once the pimp has the victim isolated, that is when the relationship flips. The victim is now a part of the sex trafficking market through force or manipulation.
In our textbook, Roger explains that young adults are learning to sacrifice in their relationships without losing a sense of identity. However, others may experience difficulties in maintaining a stable sense of self when they are involved in close relationships. These problems may lead to issues of self-identity, healthy boundaries, and relationship skills. Such a person could be more vulnerable to sex trafficking, though. Ryan Dalton is a co-founder of Rescue Forensics, a nonprofit company that helps law enforcement collect and document online evidence to prosecute traffickers in court. He states, "It's almost never an abduction. It's not like that Liam Neeson movie Taken, which is what a lot of people think of. It's an abuse of love or trust. It's a deep psychological manipulation. Traffickers will seek out women with low self-esteem and then shower them with attention, money, or care. They'll groom this person over time until they become compliant and have sex in order to receive affection. A trauma bond is created." The Polaris Project warns that sex traffickers may lure victims with false promises of high-paying jobs or fake affections. The victims may be offered gifts, compliments, sexual and physical intimacy, while they are promised fast money, future luxuries, and a better life. The trafficker eventually employs a variety of control tactics, including physical and emotional abuse, sexual assault, confiscation of identification and money, isolation from friends and family, and even renaming the victims. The World Health Organization explains that the psychological damage to victims of sex trafficking can be devastating. Poor mental health is a dominant and persistent adverse health effect, and consequences can include depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, as well as thoughts of suicide. Forced or coerced use of drugs and alcohol is frequent in sex trafficking. Drugs and alcohol may also be used as a means to control individuals or as a coping method by the victim. Imposed social isolation, such as prevention of family contact or restriction of a person's movements, is used to maintain power over people in trafficking situations. America's Daughters was a poem written by a survivor of sex trafficking. An excerpt explains the psychological implications. Quote, "When you don't know yourself and you don't love yourself, you will fall for anything that sounds like love and feels like love." End quote. Polaris states that the needs of survivors are among the most complex of crime victims, often requiring a multidisciplinary approach to address severe trauma, medical needs, immigration, legal issues, safety concerns, shelter, basic needs, and financial hardship. Ethics is defined by the Oxford Dictionary as the moral principles that govern a person's or a group's behavior. Sex trafficking is obviously illegal. The FBI states, "It is sad but true, here in this country people are being bought, sold, and smuggled like modern-day slaves." The FBI goes on to say that sex trafficking also facilitates the illegal movement of immigrants across borders, provides a ready source of income for organized crime, and even terrorists. Ethics also go beyond the sex traffickers. The National Human Trafficking Resource Center reminds us that individuals who buy commercial sex provide the demand and profit incentive for traffickers. Many buyers of commercial sex are unaware, ill-informed, or in denial of the abusive realities of commercial sex.
Socioeconomic theory influences sex trafficking of adults because it proposes that there is an underlying relationship between social standing and economic activity. This is illustrated by the fact that every country's role in the sex trafficking industry is directly related to the local and global economic environments, the country's poverty and employment rates, levels of human development, and per capita income. Thus, countries are typically in the exporting role, trafficking women and children out of the country, are more likely to be economically unstable than more affluent destination countries. This affects women particularly, as they are significantly more likely to experience economic vulnerability due to a deficit in sustainable career options and lack of educational opportunities, which becomes more prevalent in economically unstable countries.
Victims of human trafficking have absolutely no freedoms and experience horrors such as abuse, violence, deprivation, and torture. These kinds of conditions often lead to trauma. Many try to escape, and if they are caught, they are harshly punished. Typical injuries can include broken bones, concussions, bruising, burns, as well as other injuries consistent with assault. Some of these serious injuries can cause lasting health problems and may require long-term treatment. Trafficking victims are often made to participate in sexual activities through physical or non-physical force, which can consist of pressure from someone with authority over them, bribery, and manipulation. The Johns use drugs and alcohol to get the victims to cooperate. Many victims use drugs and alcohol to numb their pain. Some of them become addicts as a result of this. These physical and emotional consequences include post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, depression, disconnection from feelings, anxiety disorder, self-blame, hopelessness, feelings of helplessness, nightmares, anger and anger management issues, suicidal ideation and attempts, paranoia, fear, insomnia, shame, grief, and distrust. Victims of sex trafficking can also experience health problems that stem from forced commercial sex acts and prostitution because their sexual and reproductive health is not cared for, which can result in sexually transmitted diseases, menstrual problems, miscarriages, forced abortions, and infertility. Numerous case studies have found that women in prostitution have significantly higher rates of sexually transmitted diseases and infections, hepatitis, HIV, and AIDS. Sexually transmitted diseases of the upper and lower reproductive tracts, including syphilis, genital herpes, gonorrhea, and chlamydia, increase the HIV transmissions rates in women 2 to 10 times more than men. Sex trafficking promotes societal breakdown by removing the victims from their families and communities. Trafficking fuels organized crime groups that usually participate in many other illegal activities, including drug and weapons trafficking and money laundering. It negatively impacts local and national labor markets due to the loss of human resources. Trafficking undermines government authority, encourages widespread corruption, and threatens the security of vulnerable populations. Those who have experienced sex trafficking are the ones who must cope with the majority of the social impacts.